Thanks very much, Greg. I just said to Greg that I'm sorry to have alarmed him by my late arrival, but it was a late arrival into Melbourne Airport. Thank you at the start for doing me the honour and inviting me to speak here today. It's been my pleasure over the last 3 years to work closely with the Global Terrorism Research Centre at Monash and with Pete Lentini and others, and also to participate at least on the margins of the ARC Radicalisation project, which I think is something of a model of whole of government cooperation. Federal government, state government, communities, and of course academia. What I wanted to do today was probably to set a scene, set a context in which the conference will take place by having a look at transnational terrorism 10 years on. Has it been defeated or diffused? What's worked and what lies ahead? Well, the tsunami of analysis and commentary which is beginning to overwhelm us as we approach the anniversary of the massive terrorist attack on the US on 9/11 reflects the enormous impact these events have had on the decade which has followed. At 9/11, it was widely assumed by governments, pundits and the public that this cataclysmic event represented a major global strategic shift and security challenge. The United States 9/11 Commission report spoke of a new era and proclaimed that countering terrorism had become, beyond any doubt, the top national security priority for the United States. The US proclaimed itself engaged in a global war on terror. In much of the Western world, strategic priorities and doctrines were reordered and security budgets reshaped and enlarged. Afghanistan and Iraq were invaded. Intelligence, police and military forces were given new missions and capabilities. Counter-terrorist legislation was introduced or its reach significantly expanded. Costly protective security measures impinged on all our lives, from airports to malls, checkpoints, barriers, bollards and closed-circuit televisions. UN resolutions were passed, new bodies established, and new cooperative relationships within and between governments developed. Jobs, such as my own, were created. Well, did the scale of the threat warrant such massive changes? And what's been achieved? Only yesterday, a US report entitled 10th Anniversary Report Card, the status of the 9/11 Commission recommendations, gave its answer: not enough. It focused on continuing shortcomings, particularly in detection and emergency response. At the end of this eventful decade, following the dramatic death of Osama bin Laden and tectonic shifts which are now underway in the Arab world, it's appropriate, I think, to take stock, to examine the claims of a paradigm shift, to look at how effectively we've responded and how in turn this has changed the nature of the problem, and more particularly how best to address it in the decade ahead. The current uprisings in the Arab world have this year added a largely unexpected additional dimension to this. They've created new uncertainties about the shape of governments in the Middle East, the participation of Islamists in successor governments, their level of commitment to counter-terrorism, and the space which may become available to extremist groups. It's these systemic changes, if they come about, that may be truly strategic in their geopolitical implications. Would you excuse me? Well, is this really a new paradigm or simply another security challenge? Well, I think transnational terrorism needs to be kept in perspective. It doesn't represent an existential or a territorial threat to most countries. It can have a disproportionate impact That's one of its objectives, and it can present unique challenges for the security policymaker. But it's best considered as one of a number of evolving but enduring security challenges or contingencies with which we must deal and for which we must plan. Terrorism may be taking new and challenging paths, but it's an old technique, long used by politically motivated but weak groups throughout history to deliver an asymmetric impact, maximising fear, uncertainty and disruption. What's really new is that it's empowered by cheap and accessible technology and mobility arising from globalisation. For the sake of simplicity in reflecting the primary terrorist challenge to Australia and Western security at the present time, as well as that in many Muslim countries, I'll focus today on transnational jihadist terrorism. It has particular complexity and reach compared with many earlier forms of purely politically inspired terrorism, because a violent political ideology with global claims has been built upon an absolutist interpretation of a religious faith. Our opposition to the violent ideology can sometimes quite effectively be painted by its followers as being anti-Islamic. Jihadist terrorism is not a purely Arab phenomenon, although key ideologues and movements came principally from the Arab world, and extremists elsewhere in the Muslim world look back to the Arab world as a source of religious legitimacy and historical association. Al-Qaeda's narrative, its simplistic ideology, is likely to be a more enduring product than the organisation itself, drawing on a wellspring of perceived oppression, injustice and discrimination. But I emphasise it is confined to a very small extremist fringe within Islam, and it has singularly failed to become a mass movement. Its inability to catalyse the Muslim Ummah or to deliver on its objectives has been a major failure. Its violence has disproportionately affected Muslims, who've borne the majority of casualties. Well, what does it look like now? Al-Qaeda's core leadership, the inspirational vanguard and the organisational heart of the movement, has been decimated by a decade of relentless targeting of its key operatives. Few key figures remain, and recruitment of experienced and trusted successors has suffered. Since the dramatic and debilitating elimination of Osama bin Laden on the 2nd of May, Al-Qaeda has also lost Ilyas Kashmiri, Atia Abdul Rahman al-Libi, two of its most important operational commanders in drone strikes. And Harun Fazul, a key Al-Qaeda-linked Al-Shabaab leader, was killed in Mogadishu in June, while Bali bomber associate Umar Patek, a key Indonesian terrorist, is awaiting trial in Indonesia after being detained in Abbottabad in Pakistan in January. So Al-Qaeda's ability to plan and implement mass casualty attacks, its cohesion and its capability has markedly diminished. Its safe haven in the Fatah area of Pakistan is under pressure, and its internal cohesion is at risk. It's preoccupied with survival, its ability to communicate is limited, its fundraising has been squeezed, and its recruitment has dropped. Its new leader lacks charisma or deep loyalty, and the exploitation of material seized in Abbottabad has increased its vulnerability. Having said all that, I think it would be premature to declare it's in its death throes. Al-Qaeda's leadership has been resilient, committed and durable, and could regenerate should conditions permit it to do so. It continues to pose a threat. And its narrative and its iconic status has and will continue to give focus and allegiance to a loose, geographically diverse and largely independent range of jihadist movements, cells and individuals. Indeed, the scale of the jihadist challenge has arguably grown over the decade despite our significant counter-terrorism successes. The decentralisation and diffusion of Al-Qaeda-linked or inspired extremists, together with their greater security awareness and their ability skillfully to utilise readily available technologies and to probe points of vulnerability in our societies, means in fact that we face a more difficult CT landscape, harder to detect and harder to preempt. The terrorist threat is changing in its shape and its geographic spread, its security consciousness, its modes of operation, its adaptation, innovation and participation. These characteristics are presenting significant new challenges in identifying and locating terrorist groups and individuals. We're seeing, as part of this shifting landscape, the development of a new generation of self-radicalised extremists, dispersed, often unaffiliated, and largely invisible to intelligence and law enforcement agencies, often energised and empowered over the internet. Attacks mounted by them may increasingly be small-scale, opportunistic, with little preparation, training or lead times. Failed attacks may be considered successful due to their disruptive effects, the demonstration they make of vulnerability and the generation of fear and uncertainty. So what I'm saying really is that the spectrum of possible modes and scale of attack has widened from extensively planned mass casualty attacks, which are probably harder now to undertake as they're more likely to be detected, through to what some describe as micro-terrorism, simple local actions on the part of very small cells or individuals acting alone. The threat can often be linked to failing or deeply troubled states, to poverty, marginalisation and social dislocation, to separatist insurgencies and to local agendas, and sometimes even to state actors. But the new paradigm for us in the West is that it can also arise internally in developed and democratic societies. Realistically, it's going to be with us for a generation or longer, and there may be no point at which victory can be declared. I thought at this point I might say a little bit about the impact of the Arab uprisings. Since the beginning of this year, we've witnessed major shifts in the politics of the Arab world. I guess some of these were not unexpected because a number of countries have had ageing, repressive, unpopular, sclerotic, authoritarian governments. But the uprisings came perhaps sooner than we'd expected and with an unexpected level of contagion. And I think its prediction at this point, as these events continue to unfold, remains hazardous. But concerns have been expressed that this will open opportunities for radical Muslim movements to capture the political process. While this is not so far much in evidence, and I would argue is not inevitable, prolonged instability may be allowing some extremist groups, most notably in Libya and Yemen, to recruit, to capture weapons and to expand their areas of safe haven. And as the period of uncertainty and stability lengthens, opportunities for Salafist parties and activists are growing, and of course also terrorists released from prison, particularly in Egypt and Libya, could return to violence. Political Islam has been a factor in the Middle East since the Muslim Brotherhood was established by Hassan al-Banna in Egypt in the 1920s. Its political legitimacy derives from an appeal both to nationalism and Islam, and it can serve to unify tribes and clans into a common political program. But I wanted to just clarify that political Islam does not equate with, or necessarily, or even normally, support jihadist terrorism. This, I think, is a frequent misconception in Western public discourse. As the French scholar Olivier Roy has documented, political Islam has singularly failed to capture majority support other than in Iran, and even there it's clearly under challenge. Instead, I think the uprisings in the Middle East today reflect generational shift and have been driven initially at least by issues of governance and political participation. It's about corruption and equity, a response to repression. The uprisings have originated in secular movements and have not been driven by religious issues or extremist manipulation. Driven by youth, what Olivier Wyche describes as a post-Islamist generation. Their beginnings in peaceful protests and calls for democracy and reform were focused on local issues, and they ran directly counter to Al-Qaeda's totalitarian narrative and calls for violence to overthrow apostate governments. Paradoxically, of course, it's been the West, not Al-Qaeda, assisting pro-democracy demonstrators, and neither Israel, the US, nor the West has been the target of demonstrations. Al-Qaeda, its affiliates and associates were caught by surprise by the uprisings and have largely been unable to capitalise on them. Indeed, I think the largely indifferent Arab response to Osama bin Laden's death suggests his message has lost relevance amongst most Muslims. Unresponsive and corrupt governments have fuelled political Islam and given oxygen to extremists. The passing of such governments, assuming more representative and accountable ones follow, and the jury's still very much out on that, removes a key Al-Qaeda claim for support. The transitions underway present new opportunities for well-organised Islamist political parties and groups, both moderate and more extreme. As this process plays out, they may secure a greater role in government, and that may well present us with some uncomfortable foreign policy challenges. And if the transitions result in increased sectarianism, and that is evident in some of these countries, in other words, of violent divides within Islam itself, much of the promise inherent in the uprisings will be lost, and new opportunities may be potentially created for extremists. But while the outcomes of the current turmoil are far from clear, there's no inevitability in growing space for Islamist extremism and violence. Opinion polling shows support for Al-Qaeda's brand of extremism has slumped in Muslim-majority countries over the last few years, and bin Laden's passing may further accelerate this trend. Well, I've talked about the Al-Qaeda core being in a very bad way. The action, in many respects, has shifted to its offspring. Al-Qaeda has 3 affiliates, which now carry much of the banner for the organisation, operating with a large degree of independence and spreading the challenge for security professionals. There is Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, a union of Yemeni and Saudi extremists, which is able to operate increasingly freely in some tribal areas of Yemen, and which has demonstrated the capability to target both the Yemeni and Saudi governments and the West. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is now perhaps the most active arm of the movement, and could in fact become both its ideological and operational core in the period ahead, particularly as the current instability in Yemen is allowing it to expand its operational space. Secondly, there's Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which, though it's been greatly reduced by United States pressure and tactics and Iraqi exhaustion with its excessive violence, can still deliver, as we've seen in recent weeks, carnage on a grand scale, largely in support of Sunni sectarian interests in Shia-majority Iraq. The United States withdrawal and instability in Iraq could give it renewed impetus, and its vision might well extend beyond Iraq's borders. Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, which operates loosely across remote areas of southern Algeria, the Sahel, Mali, Niger and Mauritania, largely extorting funding through kidnapping, is also of concern. It may be moving deeper into local communities and obtaining weapons from the unrest in Libya. It may also be working with the Nigerian jihadist group Boko Haram, which last week attacked the UN headquarters in Abuja. They are probably the 3 formal affiliates. In addition, there's Al-Shabaab in Somalia, which has been increasingly linked to and in communication with Al-Qaeda. It's also, of course, in close geographic proximity to Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula in Yemen, and it presents a security challenge to Kenya and Uganda. Its harsh response to the current famine in Somalia and its apparent retreat in recent weeks from Mogadishu may constitute significant reversals, but frankly I think it's too early to judge that. With the Al-Qaeda core diminished and its focal leader gone, the leaders of the affiliates will increasingly become the force behind the global jihadist agenda. But their followers mostly have more parochial and local concerns which may undermine a focus on global objectives. Beyond the affiliates and associates, there are a wide and geographically dispersed set of militant groups and cells which share much of Al-Qaeda's ideology and objectives, but which operate without much, if any, linkages or direction from Al-Qaeda itself. These, of course, include the now fractured Jemaah Islamiyah in Indonesia, Indonesia's successor umbrella extremist group Jemaah Ansar Tauhid, Negara Islam Indonesia, a group like Jemaah Islamiyah with historical roots in Darul Islam, and a range of small but persistent extremist groups across the archipelago. The Abu Sayyaf group in the southern Philippines, and a broad spectrum of active militant and extremist groups in Pakistan, as well, of course, as continuing elements in Afghanistan, but also Lebanon and the radical Palestinian movement. Of particular concern is the range and scale of militant and extremist groups in Pakistan. From Lashkar-e-Toiba, Jaish Muhammad, Harakatul Mujahideen, Lashkar-e-Jhangvi and Sipah-e-Sahaba, right through to the Haqqani network and parts of the Pakistani Taliban, some of which have enjoyed official backing as assets in Pakistan's geopolitical manoeuvring vis-à-vis India and Afghanistan. And they now potentially, I think, threaten stability in Pakistan itself. Some are no longer fully under Pakistani government control and have developed global jihadist ambitions. Growing intolerance in Pakistan provides fertile soil for all these groups, some of which target the Pakistani state itself. And as I've outlined above, there are the radicalised individuals, the so-called homegrown terrorists, who may develop some links to established cells or groups, and so-called lone wolves, operating by themselves and simply inspired or motivated by the Al-Qaeda narrative. Unburdened by organisational constraints and planning imperatives, their unpredictability and isolation presents intelligence and law enforcement challenges. They're of particular concern to Western societies. The United States saw 43 cases of homegrown terrorism last year and has indicted over 180 individuals on terrorism charges since 9/11. Homegrown terrorists, because of their largely invisible activities and associations, present a major CT challenge to us in the West. But they may also present a growing threat in the Muslim world as internet access increases. Which leads me to say something about the importance of the internet, and I'll also speak briefly about diaspora communities. Extremist use of the internet and online publishing expands the reach of fringe extremist groups. Of particular concern has been the publication by the Yemeni-American extremist preacher Anwar al-Awlaki and the Pakistani-American Samir Khan of a sophisticated English-language online magazine, Inspire, encouraging individuals in the English-speaking world to undertake acts of violence, providing them with an accessible Islamic justification for doing so, and providing practical information on bomb making and other individual means of undertaking an attack. The sophistication of this online magazine and its faultless English make the jihadist message available potentially to a massively larger audience. More broadly, the Internet's web communities can serve as a social network for the socially isolated or disaffected individual, providing a virtual peer group of like-minded and a justification for violent action. The Internet has wide uses for the terrorist. It can be a propaganda and recruitment tool, a source of data and a source of knowledge transfer, a fundraiser, a medium for the transfer of funds, and it's used for operational planning and communication. The technology, as we all know, is accessible, it's low cost, it's immediate, it's portable, it's unregulated, it's global. Social networking via chat rooms, forums, YouTube, Facebook and Twitter provide additional opportunities for terrorist communication, proselytisation and association. In addition, the proliferation of jihadist websites continues. They number in the thousands, and there are difficulties and issues in disruption and manipulation, particularly in liberal societies like our own. We saw that most recently with the most recent 6th edition of the Inspire magazine, which most of you will be aware contained a full-page picture of the Sydney Opera House, drawing a very unfortunate associative link. Self-radicalised individuals, often having radicalised over the Internet, are appearing as perpetrators of lone wolf attacks, where the individual involved may have no formal or even informal association with Al-Qaeda or its offshoots. I wanted to mention briefly diaspora communities. I think this is another developing factor. It's not new, but it may be more evident, is the linkages some members of diaspora communities in the West have retained or developed with extremist causes or groups in their countries of origin. There's no single pattern in this phenomenon, with different generations involved and for different reasons in different countries of settlement, a point I think made by Mark in his opening remarks. But there may be some common threads evident in levels of socio-economic disadvantage, alienation, unemployment or discrimination, making the Al-Qaeda narrative of injustice and Western discrimination against Islam an attractive rationale, and its call to act a compelling one for those who feel angry or powerless. In the sort of final moments of my address, I wanted to just try and bring this back, having set a global context, bring this back to why is this important to Australia? What is the challenge for Australia? It's our judgment, I think, that Al-Qaeda led, associated or inspired transnational terrorism will remain an enduring and evolving security threat internationally, and Australia will remain a target. 111 Australian citizens have lost their lives in 9 major international terrorist attacks from 9/11 on, and many more than this have suffered injury and loss. Those are the minimum figures. If you count Australian civilians, for instance, working with contractors in Iraq, in war zone, or in Afghanistan, the numbers are rather larger. And in addition, of course, the Australian Embassy in Jakarta was badly damaged by a terrorist attack in 2004. Australia has been regularly listed as a legitimate target in Al-Awlaki's Inspire magazine, also by Al-Qaeda's principal ideologue, Ayman Zawahiri, now the new leader of Al-Qaeda, and by Jamaat Islamiyah's Abu Bakr Bashir. Australia has served as part of Western-led coalitions in Afghanistan and Iraq, and a small number of Australians have been associated with extremist organisations overseas, and others have been convicted for plotting attacks within Australia itself. Relevant to Australia in particular, of course, is the situation in Southeast Asia and in particular in Indonesia. Southeast Asia in some ways has perhaps demonstrated the greatest success in responding to the jihadist terrorist threat over the last decade. Indonesia in particular has faced down a persistent violent extremist challenge from Jamaat Islamiyah, and related organisations and splinter groups who've mounted a series of high-profile mass casualty and more limited attacks within Indonesia. Since the first Bali bombing in October 2002, which claimed 202 lives, 88 of whom were Australians, the Indonesian National Police have pursued JI with determination, as well as associated groups and key individuals, dismembering what was a highly structured organisation with a core cadre of Afghan-trained veterans with international links to Al-Qaeda and others. JI has been fractured and greatly diminished, but the exposure of a terrorist training camp in Aceh about 18 months ago and continued planning by small numbers of extremists points to an enduring extremist challenge. Earlier this year, there were several attacks and attempted attacks. Book bombs sent to liberal Muslim figures and senior police, a suicide bombing in a mosque intended to kill police, and a defused bomb intended to detonate in a church on Good Friday. These incidents fit an emerging pattern of attacks by smaller splinter groups, shorter planning cycles with a mix of old cadre and a newer generation involved, and focused principally on targeting Indonesian police and government officials. There's some evidence of a convergence between members of some Islamic vigilante groups and extremists as well. But since 2002, Indonesia has arrested over 640 people on terrorism-related offences and secured, I think, approaching 500 convictions. This very public process has served to build understanding within Indonesia of the nature and scale of the threat it faced. Indonesia has, with its partners, built a sophisticated police counter-terrorism capability and demonstrated a long-term commitment to dealing with the drivers of radicalisation. But as recent events have shown, there are still weaknesses in Indonesia's social framework which can permit extremism to fester. These include muted official responses to religious intolerance, a continued tolerance of extremist publishing, continued student indoctrination in a small number of extremist boarding schools or pesantren, some campus radicalisation in the Islamic Universities network, shortcomings in prison management, inadequate sentencing and early release of prisoners, and flawed de-radicalisation or rehabilitation programs for terrorist prisoners. So there's a lot of work to be done there. Malaysia and Singapore, I think, are on top of the problems in their particular countries. The Philippines and Thailand, which both face separatist insurgencies in their Muslim-majority southern provinces, are by and large working well with regional and international partners to build CT capability and individually to address the grievances which have given rise to discontent. In my view, if governments in both the Philippines and Thailand were determined to seek settlements by negotiating some form of autonomy arrangements in their southern provinces, these problems could largely be dealt with. They are mostly local in nature and they require locally developed processes of resolution. Finally, just a comment on counter-terrorism. I mentioned at the outset that this was a whole-of-government exercise. It's extensive and collaborative, and it goes beyond government, of course, in its need to involve communities. I think I've made it clear that contemporary terrorism is transnational, and hence our responses also require a collaborative transnational response. Cooperation between governments and relevant government agencies is critical. Counter-terrorism is intelligence-led, but it requires the involvement of many arms of government and close coordination between them if it's going to be effective. With the death of bin Laden, the important role of special operations forces, the role they play in front-end intelligence collection and in preemption in particular, of course, was very evident. But it's only one element. Terrorism as Peter Keogh mentioned, is in the end a potent form of criminality, where intelligence, military support, law enforcement, the application of due legal process, counter-radicalisation, social and community integration, socio-economic development, education, and the rehabilitation of convicted terrorists all form part of a coherent policy response. In short, counter-terrorism requires a whole-of-government response. And, of course, cooperation in a federal state like Australia, close cooperation between federal and state governments and territories. In military terms, in some ways, because of this wide involvement, it parallels in many respects in a full spectrum counterinsurgency in needing to address all these sort of factors. We have to accept that we're dealing with a long-term issue. 10 years after 9/11, governments are increasingly turning, I think, to longer-term strategies, and this is indeed where the work of this ARC radicalisation project fits in. We're turning to longer-term strategies in our own societies and in terms of support for our neighbours and vulnerable countries more widely to ameliorate the conditions which may give rise to terrorism. Australia, I think, has a very commendable role as a leader in counter-terrorism capacity building and support, particularly in the development of intelligence and law enforcement capabilities, working with our partners in Southeast Asia and, in fact, well beyond Southeast Asia. We also attach priority to assisting regional countries with so-called counter-radicalisation programs which aim to counter the conditions which give rise to extremism. But as I think I've suggested, these conditions and the motivations of individuals are so variable and so often so local that common pathways towards extremist violence remain unclear, and hence appropriate strategies to preempt individual engagement or to rehabilitate convicted terrorists are still largely experimental. Multidisciplinary approaches, as are envisaged in the ARC radicalisation project, I think, are likely to be essential, particularly in developing nations. Development assistance programs which address socio-economic disadvantage and exclusion are likely, in my view, it's not everyone shares this view, but are likely, in my view, to have long-term positive effects. But in the end, no single approach, nor any single arm of government, or single government for that matter, can effectively deal with the issues raised by transnational terrorism. It requires wide collaboration at the local, national and international levels, and it's going to require a sustained commitment over an extended period. Thank you.